Hello, everybody. I'm happy to welcome you to this third session of our Adventures in Ideas seminar on polarization and presidential elections that divided America. I'm Lloyd Kramer, a professor of history at UNC and also the director of Carolina Public Humanities, which has sponsored and organized this event. And I launched our seminar on Monday. I hope many of you were with us when we talked about the polarized election of 1800. And yesterday, Freddie Kiger extended our discussion with his outstanding presentation on the election of 1860. So today we're going to expand the historical analysis into the 20th century with our speaker, Suzanne Globetti from UNC's Department of Political Science. We're again at Flyleaf Books here in Chapel Hill, and my colleague Paul Bonici is managing the technology for this event along with some backup assistance from Vicki Breeden. Paul's doing a great job of keeping all of the technology running, and I want to thank both Paul and Vicki for their outstanding work. We'll be following the same format that we've used in the previous sessions of this seminar. You won't be able to turn on your camera or your audio function on the computer, but you can send questions and comments through the Q&A tab on your Zoom screen, and you're welcome to do that at any point during the talk and also afterwards. I'll share the questions with Suzanne after she completes her talk, and then we'll continue our discussion in this question and answer format. I thank you for joining us today as we continue our historical conversation about past American elections. And I thank all of our friends and supporters who have contributed to CPH and helped to sustain our programs during the current pandemic. Your support is very much appreciated. And we also want to thank the support of Carolina Meadows and the Cotton Merker Group at Morgan Stanley for their ongoing support. In advance of the seminar, you received some information about how to give to CPH, one of the attachments to information about the seminar, and we invite you to consider continuing to support CPH. And I thank all of you who've helped us continue our activities during this pandemic period. I also want to remind you that we're recording each session of the seminar, so you can go back later to review something if you want to see it again. Or you can watch a session that you could not see during the live Zoom broadcast. This will be available within the next week or two, and it will be online for a couple of weeks. Only available to people who registered for the seminar. As you know from our previous sessions, we're focusing this week on highly polarized American elections, and we're focusing especially on the elections of 1800, 1860, and 1968. These years had exceptional influence in American history because so many people in each of these years believed that the Republic was in a crisis. It might even fall apart. So I'm pleased to welcome Suzanne to this seminar to continue our discussion and looking especially at the tumultuous events of 1968. These events may have a more personal historical meaning for many of you because you actually lived through that era of conflict and polarization, and its legacy is still very much a part of our own political culture in 2020. You've received a biographical summary of Suzanne's professional career in the materials that we sent out before the seminar, but I want to very briefly note a couple of highlights on the journey that has brought Suzanne Globetti to our political science department at UNC. She received her BA degree at the University of Virginia and then went on to complete a PhD in government at the University of Texas in Austin. She then taught at Bowdoin College in Maine and later moved to Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, where she was a very successful and popular teacher in their political science department. Suzanne came to Chapel Hill last year, wisely, I should say, and she's now a teaching associate professor in the political science department. So we're very fortunate to have her as a UNC colleague because she's an expert on modern election campaigns and on the factors that affect voter choices in these campaigns. She's published notable articles on political decision-making and she teaches courses on American government and on subjects such as the role of public opinion in modern politics. So we're pleased that Suzanne has joined us today at Flyleaf Books to talk about another era of extreme polarization in America. And the title of her talk is The Culture Wars and Politics in the Election of 1968. Please put your hands together to welcome Suzanne Globetti. Suzanne, take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I want to thank you all so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I've enjoyed so much listening to the previous night's discussions about the election of 1800 and 1860, and tonight I'm going to take us a little bit more modern. We're going to move maybe just about 50 years ago into the election of 1968. But to talk about 1968, I'm going to also need to back up, and I'm going to need to talk about the political landscape and those decades surrounding it. We can't just look at 1968 in a vacuum. And I think sometimes when we think about politics and we talk about politics, we tend to think about it sort of in terms of these short-term forces, these events. Who are the candidates, right? What are their personalities like? What are their advertisements? How do they do in debates? What are these important gaffes, we think, or at least we think they're important, that happen during these quadrennial elections? But elections actually turn on the issues and the issues of the day. And those issues are the ones that resonate with people. And there's so many issues. And so what we're going to ask is, why, out of the infinite number of issues, are there certain issues that basically make it, right? That become the ones that politics is fought over? And why then, when those issues make it, do some of them continue on and become a permanent feature in our landscape? And I would submit to you that what we're going to talk about in the 60s is still incredibly relevant to what we are seeing today. Now, part of this is chance, and part of this are external events, and part of this is a conscious effort on the part of political elites to frame elections in terms of issues that are going to benefit them electorally. And so what we see is something that Ted Carmines and Jim Stimson, formerly of the UNC department here, who many of you I'm sure know or are familiar with his work, call an issue evolution. So issues evolve over time in a dynamic process. So similar to evolution that we might learn about in biology, this doesn't just happen overnight. So with this combination, when issues come about, we do see this dynamic process over time. Now, from the 1930s through the 1950s and on into the early 60s, politics was fought primarily over New Deal issues. And I say primarily because we know that we had Dwight Eisenhower in the middle there, we had Korea, we had some other issues. But the main overriding issue of the time was, should we intervene, and how much should we intervene in the economy? So we had economic issues that were of the utmost importance. And that all began really changing in the 1950s and the 1960s, when we saw tensions over race in particular bubbling under the surface, and then finally bubbling over and threatening this party system, threatening to tear it apart and to completely reorder it in a new way. And that's what happened ultimately in 1968. But if you were in 1964, you'd be forgiven for not seeing any of that happening. Lyndon Johnson was elected in a landslide in 1964. So it's hard for us to imagine now, when we're looking at polls and we're seeing very small differences between the candidates. But LBJ won by 22 percentage points, and he carried all but 6 states that year. And then on his coattails, the Congress, the Democrats picked up 37 seats in Congress. They had a massive 295 to 140 advantage, huge advantage. The Senate, 68 Democrats to 32 Republicans. The Republicans seemed like a defunct party. They seemed dead. LBJ had in the 70% approval from Republicans when he first started. And so when we think about these things, we say, things seemed pretty good in 1964, on this right path. All right. And in fact, In Rick Perlstein's book called Nixon Land, he recounts several quotes that I thought I wanted to highlight to you all to show what was the feeling like in 1964. So LBJ, upon his landslide victory, goes out to speak to people, and he says, "I doubt there has ever been so many people seeing so many things alike on Decision Day." And a little bit over a month later, he goes to light the Christmas tree at the White House, and he declares, "These are the most hopeful times in all the years since Christ was born in Bethlehem." Now think about it, this is just a year after President Kennedy has been assassinated. So in part, he's trying to comfort people, but he's also sensing this real optimism and this real change in the air. And then at the State of the Union address, he goes on to say, "We've achieved a unity of interest," that word unity, "among our people that is unmatched in the history of freedom." So that's 1964. Everything is looking like people are on board, they're together. Now, we flash forward to 1968, and the things are much different. Things have changed considerably. It no longer seems, and for many of you all who lived through this, I'm sure you can account to this, it no longer seems like the most hopeful time since Christ was born in Bethlehem. LBJ is not even running for president in 1968. The public and his own party have soured on him. He's decided to give up and not seek or accept the nomination. That year, the end of January, begins with the Tet Offensive, which I'll talk about a little bit more later when I talk about Vietnam, but it's a surprise attack by the Viet Cong, and it ends up casting doubt in Americans' minds about how well this war really is going. 1968 would also turn out to be one of the most deadly years in the Vietnam War. In April of that year, Martin Luther King goes to Memphis to help with the sanitation strike, and he's assassinated. About 2 months later, Robert Kennedy, who's running for the Democratic nomination at this point, John F. Kennedy's brother, is also assassinated after his big victory in the California primary. So think about what we have here. We have an election, we don't have an incumbent, and LBJ, by the way, decides this at the end of March of that year. We have a candidate who's now been assassinated. And after Martin Luther King is assassinated, we see riots breaking out all over the country with lots of property damage, loss of life, and these pictures of cities aflame. We see the pictures here of just the massive destruction. And then we even see the Democratic National Convention, where that violence we see spilling out. We see it outside of the hall, and we even see it coming inside the hall. And then there's this other very chaotic element that we have, and that's this third-party candidate, George Wallace, a segregationist former governor of Alabama, and he decides he's going to run as an independent. And for a really long time that year, he's polling in the low to mid-20s. And it looks like there's a really good chance that he could throw this entire election into the House of Representatives. And we haven't seen a third-party candidate do as well as he ended up doing, I believe, since the election of 1800, which we talked about earlier. He ends up peaking at that 20-something percent, gets 13% of the vote nationally and 45 electoral votes. So what happened to change everything so dramatically? How did we move from this moment of such unity to this moment of division and chaos and being on fire? So I'm going to talk about those issues and what sort of set that in motion, right? But I'm going to suggest ultimately that these three issues that I'm going to highlight are all part and parcel of the same thing. And so just to kind of preview what I'm going to say, these issues all come down to one big cleavage, which is on one side an elite, a media elite, an urban elite, young college-educated metropolitan elite on one side that is against the war in Vietnam, that wants to open society up for minorities, wants to have more opportunities for women. And on the other side, you see a side that's fearful of these changes, that feels threatened by these changes in the order. And so these two sides, I would say, we still see a lot of these things happening today. Between one side that wants to open up society and is not as afraid of these changes, embracing of diversity, and another side that wants to go slower or doesn't want this to happen at all. So before I go into talking more about these issues, I do want to put the candidates up. And so we have first here Hubert Humphrey. Now, Hubert Humphrey decides to enter the race when Johnson decides that he is not going to run. So he doesn't get into the race until somewhat later. This hadn't been something that he had planned on doing. Humphrey is the happy warrior. He's the former senator from Minnesota, and he gets into the race, and he's, of course, naturally very associated with Johnson. So Johnson being a president overseeing a war that's not particularly popular, that's something that Humphrey is going to have to deal with whenever he is running for president. One important point about Humphrey that I'll return to later is that he wins the Democratic nomination, and I will discuss that fight more in a moment, without entering a single primary. We know about our system today, which is based on a primary system where ordinary people go and select who's going to win. That was not the case, even in 1968. The majority of the electorate, of the delegates at the convention, were going to be selecting who they wanted. And so Humphrey is the old guard. He's the choice of labor. At that time, labor is incredibly important to the Democratic Party. He's representing that administration, that old guard. Then we have Nixon. Nixon, who has somehow risen from the dead, from the political dead. He loses in 1960, and then in 1962, he runs for the governor of California. He loses that too. And apparently afterward, people say, you've got to go out and talk to the press. And he's very surly and unhappy, and he goes out to speak to the press. And in the middle of that discussion, he tells the press, you're not going to have me to kick around anymore because this is the last press conference I'm ever going to have. Well, then we look 6 years later, and he's become the Republican nominee. He had an easier fight, by the way. It looked that he would have some competition from George Romney, from Nelson Rockefeller in particular, who are more of the liberal, the Northeastern establishment liberals. Nixon played it very much as a centrist, and he ended up coming out on top. And then we have George Wallace. So George Wallace, as I mentioned before, is the former governor of Alabama. Now, what you probably remember about him is that he was an ardent segregationist. He is known for, at his inaugural speech, coming forward and saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So this is what Wallace is known for. He then stands in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama, trying to bar the entrance of the first African American students. But it would be a mistake to look at Wallace as just a regional candidate. Wallace had wide appeal. Certainly, he ends up winning electoral votes in the South, but he has very wide national appeal. So for those of you all who don't know, when you run for president, every state has different laws as to getting on the ballot. So you're automatically given a place on the ballot if you're part of a major party, so if you're a Democrat or a Republican. But each state has different laws as to whether or not you can be on the ballot if you're a third party. So you often have to get a number of signatures, and these vary. Some of them can be very high. Wallace manages to make it on all of the ballots, so all 50 states. In fact, he goes to California. He needs to get a certain number of signatures. He gets 100,000 signatures in California. Later, in the fall of 1968, he travels to Madison Square Garden, and he has an overflow crowd at Madison Square Garden. So Wallace has an appeal. He has this segregation component to him, but he also has an appeal as a populist. That's always been part of what people have known him for, and is an anti-elite. He talks about the liberals all the time. He talks about the media and the little guy versus the big media establishment and liberals. And so as this button shows as well, he even has on his button law and order, which is going to be one of the big topics that we're going to talk about today. So this kind of sets the stage for who the candidates are. Okay, so what about in terms of what issues are important? Now, I'm going to talk about three in particular. And I say here that they're related, and I would say in particular that Vietnam and race are very much related to each other. Race and Vietnam are very much related to law and order in terms of demonstrations about two of those things. And as I alluded to before, these three things together, I think, all cohere into this cleavage about order, basically. People who are concerned about keeping this order, people who are concerned about changing things in a way. So first, when talking about Vietnam, have a couple of things to say. The first is that although Vietnam is very important, it ends up being important for different ways in terms of how it orders this election. So the University of Michigan has biennial election studies, which many of you all may have heard of. And in 1968, when they did their study, they asked people, what's the most important problem facing America? And 40% said Vietnam. So this is on people's minds, right? And so this is obviously something that you might then think, oh, that's going to be very important when you go into the voting booth because it's on so many people's minds. But what were people thinking about Vietnam at the time, and how might it matter? Now, in 1968, I mentioned the Tet Offensive. I mentioned the Tet Offensive. So in 1968 in particular, we start to see this turn against the war. And so what happens after the Tet Offensive is this coordinated attack, which takes place over the Lunar New Year, which is a surprise. This was supposed to have a ceasefire. And the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong go into multiple cities in South Vietnam simultaneously. And this shocks Americans. Why? Because they had been led to believe, and lied to, frankly, by the president, that the war was going great, right? And they'd been led to believe that there's no way that the Viet Cong was that organized to pull off something this sophisticated. And so this shocked and really, frankly, disturbed and scared people that America might not be winning this war. And so those who have looked at the Tet Offensive later say militarily, this was a big loss for the North Vietnamese, right? But it was what happened to the turning point, the psychology of what public opinion was. So Walter Cronkite, Uncle Walter, right, the most trusted man in America, goes to Vietnam after Tet. And he travels around, he does interviews, and he comes back and puts on a primetime special on February 27th. And at the end of this primetime special, he turns and he looks in the camera and he editorializes. And he says, it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. Now, this is not a ringing endorsement. This is not what you really necessarily want to hear. And allegedly, whether it's apocryphal or not, upon hearing this, LBJ then said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost middle America. So one important thing to note, though, is that Americans, while increasingly opposed to this war, were not exactly sure about what they wanted to do in terms of bringing the troops home right away. And so I wanted to show you a little bit of data from that same 1968 poll to talk about this. So the question was asked, which of the following do you think we should do now in Vietnam? Pull out of Vietnam entirely, keep our soldiers in Vietnam but try to end the fighting, or take a stronger stand, even if it means invading North Vietnam? Now, I've taken this from an American Political Science Review article from 1969 by Philip Converse and his colleagues at Michigan, who were the premier political behavioralists at the time and still continue to be so influential. And what's interesting to me is this is from their table. And I know that Freddie we've talked a lot about the role of the South. So you see that the South, the North distinction is so important that this is how they broke down the data. So we see that Northern Democrats, Northern Republicans, Southern Democrats, and Southern Republicans, what is their support level like for the war? And actually, there is a fair number of people who want to pull out. But we also see people who are in that middle ground, who want to try and continue to end the fighting, but to stay there. And then we even see, particularly among Southern Republicans, and I'm thinking that's not a very large group at that time. So these numbers, they didn't report the ends, but I'm thinking that's a small group, want to take a stronger stand. And so although definitely sentiment was turning against the war, it wasn't 100% it wasn't 100% there. It wasn't where it was going to be. And I think this is important, but I also think it's important from this to think about in terms of ideologically. So Nixon and Humphrey are the two major party candidates, and they essentially end up taking the same position on Vietnam. Humphrey disassociates himself with Johnson eventually. People have been begging with him. They even want him to resign, to get away from the Johnson name. But he takes a really long time to do it. He finally comes out pretty strongly about how he wants to get out of Vietnam. He wants to negotiate a peace. Nixon and he have about the same position. I don't know if anyone remembers the famous quote about that election where George Wallace says there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. This is one of those positions where the two major party candidates who ends up running, now we know that the party itself had a lot of discussion about this, that there isn't that much of a difference. So Vietnam, in the end, we're not seeing that people are choosing on the basis of that because of this, but it still had a big impact. And I want to talk about how that is. It created some major divisions that year within the parties, right? Maybe not between them. What it did was invited a democratic challenge to a sitting president. We don't have a lot of people challenge a sitting president, right? No matter how popular. We see Donald Trump didn't invite any challenge this year, despite having fairly low approval ratings. So this is a very unusual thing to happen. In late 1967, a group on Capitol Hill went around trying to get people to enter the race from this anti-war wing, okay? And so they approached Gene McCarthy, Clean Gene McCarthy, and they asked him to run, and he decides that he will enter some primaries. That's how he announces it. So he gets on board. And at first, I think Johnson didn't take him particularly seriously. He was very popular, though, particularly with young college students. And so McCarthy gets about 2,000 to 3,000 college students. And keep in mind, by the way, that college students couldn't vote, many of them at the time. The voting age was not yet 18. It was 21 at this time. But he gets them to go to New Hampshire, 2,000 to 3,000. And supposedly they knocked on half the doors in New Hampshire. And McCarthy ends up with 42% of the vote, which nobody thought would happen. Now, Johnson had not even wanted to enter this primary. Remember, I told you at the beginning that we didn't even have a lot of primaries, and even if you were in one of them, the delegates weren't even bound by the results most of the times. They were more what they call beauty contests. That was the name that was given to them, to show your popularity. Johnson ends up winning, but by winning by 50 to 42, he essentially loses, and he sees the writing on the wall. He decides, and he stuns people. He goes on to give a national address, says he's going to try and halt the bombing. He's going to try and negotiate a settlement with Vietnam. And then he turns to the camera and he says, "I shall not seek, nor will I accept the nomination for president." People are stunned by this. Also, when McCarthy does so well, and before Johnson drops out, Robert Kennedy decides to run. He had been considering it, but he didn't want to run. And then he sees, wow, I might have a chance. So he decides to run. And so the two of them battle it out in the primary. And as I mentioned before, Humphrey later in April decides to run. But Humphrey doesn't join, he doesn't go into any primaries. He doesn't campaign in primaries. That's not how his path is to the nomination. So we see, as I mentioned before, that Robert Kennedy is on a roll. He wins his first big primary in California, and he is assassinated right after it. And so, of course, this was something that threw everything even more into chaos. As an aside, this is one of the great what-ifs in American history. What if Robert Kennedy hadn't been assassinated? Would he have gone on to win the election? Of course, this is one of these what-ifs that we can't know. We do know that Kennedy was incredibly popular, and assessments of him, but they were all after he had been assassinated. He was the most popular of the candidates, more popular than Humphrey, more popular than Nixon. Again, though, we don't know what would have happened. We do know that he was very charismatic and very popular among the Democrats. In the 1964 convention, when he arrived, he stepped toward the podium and he received a 22-minute standing ovation. So this shows that he would have had a lot of support. However, going into Chicago, it's not exactly sure what's going to happen. There's even some discussion that LBJ might be drafted to run after all, or that Ted Kennedy might decide to run. And so these things end up not happening. Hubert Humphrey ends up getting that labor support, the big party support, and he ends up being selected, and it's not even all that close. Well, this really upsets people who are gathered outside in Grant Park in Chicago, and this leads to a lot of violence and demonstrations that's shown all on TV. Lots of police confrontation with police. You see pictures of the police with their clubs out, and this is the vision from that particular convention. Now, one thing that I do want to suggest, actually two things. Although that anti-war new left wing lost that night, they were ultimately going to win. So what this debacle did was it led to reforming the system. This is why we have the primary system we have today, because people were left out of the process. So there was a commission that put together new rules, which basically said you can't just handpick these delegates. You have to open this process up to everyone. So this is why we have the process we have now that many people now don't like, but this is the reason why we have it. And so who came out of that? In 1972, McGovern. He's from that new left wing. He's that younger anti-war. So they won that in the end. They didn't win a lot of presidential elections after that, but they won that. The next thing is I have a picture here of a young gentleman who's getting his beard shaved. And the reason I have this is this was when McCarthy had these folks going into New Hampshire, he had a campaign called the Get Clean for Gene. The idea was that he needed these young people to be presentable. They needed to shave their beards, take off their jeans, get rid of their long hair. They needed to look very presentable. And the reason I think that is relevant is that when we're talking about a culture, and we're talking about cultural flashpoint, not everyone liked these demonstrators. And there was a real focus on that. And you could tell that McCarthy was aware of that. So this is how Vietnam is one part of this system, or one part of of what happens this particular election that we see. The second part, and I would say very enduring, because we know that Vietnam is no longer an issue, though we do know that whether or not we use force is an issue that still divides us, is race. And this is a common theme, right? Through all of the talks we've had, race has always been there. Race has always mattered. But what I would say is its importance as a political issue has waxed and waned. And one article that I read, I think, sums this up very well, so I want to make it very clear. And that is, there is overwhelming support for the notion that race systematically shapes Americans' access to benefits and vulnerability disadvantage. So race matters, but race is a political issue that waxes and wanes. And what does it depend on? So John Zoller, a very prominent political behavioralist, studies public opinion, says public opinion is a marriage of your predispositions, what you think, what information you have stored, your feelings, and the information you're receiving. That information you're receiving from your environment, that can come from events, and that can come from political elites. And so what we have with race is that the parties are going to shift very much on that issue. Now, many of you all may know this, but whenever I talk to my students, they're actually pretty shocked to find out about how the parties have shifted over time on race. So for a very long time, after Reconstruction on into the 1950s, it was not in anyone's benefit electorally to talk about race necessarily. So political elites had incentives to suppress this as an issue, particularly in the Democratic Party. So FDR comes into office, and a lot of that New Deal coalition is formed with African Americans, particularly African Americans in the North who've migrated north, but also Southerners, white Southerners. And so he's got this strange coalition, and he's got to satisfy this coalition. He's got to keep it together. So how does he do that? He tries as much as he can to suppress race as an issue, to try and stress the economics, to leave out the race as much as he can. So Roosevelt was a racial liberal, But he backed off a lot of legislation. He backed off federal anti-lynching legislation, for example. He backed off this legislation about abolishing the poll tax. And so we see that he necessarily feels sort of boxed in on this issue. Truman, by the way, we know did desegregate the armed forces, and then he comes to the 1948 convention, and he puts on that convention a very serious civil rights plank, the response of which is that the states of the Deep South bolt the convention, and you may have heard of the Dixiecrats, bolt the convention, and they don't vote for the Democrat that year. So after that, what happens is that the parties decide we're not going to want to rock the boat again, so they kind of go back to where they've been before. Now, I should say and point out, and this is where my students are always a little bit surprised about the difference, is that the Republicans of the two parties were clearly the more racially progressive. So if you go and look at the party platforms throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and earlier than that, but I'm just focusing on those, you find that the Republicans have much stronger political platforms involving race. They have more prominent, they have more coverage of them, it's more prominent on their platform. And we also know that Eisenhower, the Republican, was president in 1957 when Little Rock, Arkansas High School, when Central High School was integrated. And there was a Civil Rights Act that passed, a weak one, in 1957, but Eisenhower is the president. So what changes at that time? But what we see is, again, events, this issue evolution. And what I would suggest is a very long series of events. But we have World War II, where we have African Americans who are serving in World War II, and then they're coming back to this country. We have Brown v. Board of Education, a Supreme Court decision which ends segregation in the schools. And then we have the brave actions of thousands of civil rights activists, and just some of them who are shown here, who rode and sat in and were beaten for all the world to see, because we have television now, for all the world to see, and this forced the Democrats' hands. And many of them, I should add, especially in the North, wanted to take this step. They didn't want to just be a regional party. They had reasons. They supported racial equality, and they also saw electoral benefits as African Americans were moving into these cities in the North. And so I don't want to paint it that it was just purely a political move, but this was part of it. And these events were part of it. So JFK at first had been sort of lukewarm on getting involved with civil rights legislation, but after what he saw in Birmingham with the dogs and the hoses, he put forth a civil rights bill, and it got stalled in Congress. And he was later assassinated. People wondered, what would LBJ do? LBJ being a Southerner, having opposed integration in 1948 when he ran for Senate. But LBJ was very resolute, and he said the best way we can honor him is by passing this legislation. And so the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, which ended segregation and public accommodations. I do want to highlight something important about that Civil Rights Act. It had been filibustered. Every other act had been filibustered. That one had been filibustered as well. That was a true piece of bipartisan legislation. Today we have a piece of bipartisan legislation. We say it's bipartisan if we can get 2 or 3 senators from the other party who are going to sign on to it or decide not to filibuster it, depending on what you're looking at. This truly was. That bill was signed. The Democratic Congress was in charge. A Democratic president signed it. But to give you a sense of how the parties were so internally different then, the Northeastern Republicans really voted in great numbers for this bill. And so it truly was bipartisan. This is a change we see from then to now. We don't have these parties which have these internal contradictions. Now we're sorted completely ideologically. We don't have any conservative Democrats, and we don't have these liberal Republicans. And so that's actually going to be something we can talk about when we talk about polarization. And the Democrats didn't stop there. After Bloody Selma, whenever the demonstrators are trying to go across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and are met with George Wallace's state troopers and the sheriff, the local sheriff, Johnson then puts forth the Voting Rights Act and gets that passed as well. So the parties have staked out their positions on this. okay? And what I have here is just to show you a little bit about the Voting Rights Act, how important that was to changing the shape of politics at that time. So in 1960, for example, Alabama only had 13.7% of African Americans in the state were registered to vote. And Alabama was very egregious in this. And by the way, Selma particularly so. 29,000 residents of Selma, 15,000 of whom were African American, 300 of whom were actually registered to vote. As King said, we have more people in jail now than are registered to vote. We see Mississippi, 6.1%, and this huge increase. What did the Voting Rights Act do? It sent federal examiners down to the South and said these federal examiners then could actually look at the practices and make sure that things like literacy tests and other voter suppression tactics were not taking place. I have in the corner here something that's from my own personal archives that I included here, and that is actually my mother's poll tax receipt. So she grew up in Alabama. It's from 1964, and after she passed away, we found this in her safe deposit box, which was very interesting. I don't know if she kept it among very few papers. I don't know if it's because she knew she would have a political scientist one day, or what I like to think of, voting was just extremely important to her. So she kept this remnant of that. Now, poll tax receipts had to be shown, but I have a great hunch that if you were white, as she was, you could probably let it slide if you didn't show up with that poll tax receipt. Okay, so what happens after this? The Democrats have gone all in on civil rights, right? They're associated with that. So what are the Republicans going to do? Now keep in mind they're a minority party at that time. They haven't won the presidency much at all, besides this aberration when Eisenhower, the war hero, wins. They haven't been particularly successful winning in Congress. And so with the Southern strategy, they see an opening, right, that they can make inroads into the South. And in fact, they know this because in 1964, Barry Goldwater, who's running as the Republican, wins 6 states, 5 of which are in the Deep South. And he gets something like 70-80% of the vote in Mississippi. So Kevin Phillips was later asked about this, and he says this is what he thinks the strategy should be. From now on, the Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the black vote, and they don't need any more than that. But Republicans would be short-sighted if they weakened enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. The more blacks who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the whites who are afraid of blacks will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are. Now, how are we going to see this? Like, how exactly does this happen? Because remember, in the North especially, in the North has not been as segregated in some areas. There is definitely segregation in the North, but we see the issue playing out a little bit differently. And this is sort of how it plays out. This is a quote from Lee Atwater, who is a strategist for the Republican Party. And what Lee Atwater is talking about here is this idea of implicit appeals versus explicit appeals. So you don't want to talk about segregation. That's been settled. There's a law in place. You don't want to talk about that. So instead you talk about things that might be associated, these code words that could be associated, and get across the message for those who are listening and receptive that you're talking about African Americans. And so what Atwater's saying is, and he uses very ugly language to do it, so I'm not going to use that here, but he says in 54 you just start off using these racial epithets, right? But by 68 you can't do that anymore. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that, and you're getting so abstract. And now when you go into the 80s, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this. It's much more abstract than busing, and much more abstract than this racial epithet. And so this strategy is something that does bring in some voters who are going to be responding, and it definitely turns the South into the Republican column. Now, what about the rest of people? We talk a lot about the South, and what I have here are just a little bit to give you a sense of what opinion was like towards the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And so the reason I have this here is it's not just as if we had a very racist South, and the rest of the country was very open to racial equality, there was still a real sense of people not being 100% on board or sure about what was going on. So, for example, this is Roper Center data. Do you approve or disapprove of what the Freedom Riders are doing? The Freedom Riders were boarding buses, and they were trying to integrate these buses and sitting at the front of these buses and getting beaten up where they were going. And only 22% of people in the country, not just the South, say that they approve of this. What about sit-ins? They say, do you think these help chances? And actually they say, no, I think this hurts more. And my thing that I really point up is, what are your feelings about the March on Washington, which today we think the March on Washington is this iconic moment, that iconic picture of King sitting there looking out over the crowd with his I Have a Dream speech. And the feelings are that only 23% are favorable at that time. So this shows that this is an unsettled territory for a lot of the country, right? And then the question, how do you feel demonstrations? Demonstrations is key, because we're going to talk about law and order. What do people think about demonstrating and agitating? Do you think it's helped or hurt? Only 15%. And these are whites, by the way. This is whites only for these data. And then the last sort of piece of information, I think, gets at this again. It breaks it down. This is Converse and his colleagues, as to what do you think about a survey question, which asks, do you think there should be, how do you feel? Should there be desegregation? Do you have mixed feelings about it, or should there be strict segregation? And you see, yes, we see that desegregation is gaining in what people are supporting, but we still see a high level of mixed feelings. And so that mixed feelings is something that can be tapped into, and something that Republicans do tap into. Simultaneously, we see African Americans do move in droves to the Democratic Party. And so we see now, as we know, the Democrats are the most steadfastly loyal group to the Democratic Party, in part because of all of these events. So this idea about demonstration, that's my third part here, and it kind of wraps it all together. It wraps up feelings about Vietnam. It wraps up feelings about race. This is a picture of Watts in Los Angeles, taken in 1965, ironically 5 days after the passage and signing of the Voting Rights Act. So what we see is, at this particular time, this issue is not particularly settled, and we see that there are race riots in 1964. We see that there are race riots in 66. We see basically every particular summer we have some issue with this. And so people are leery of demonstrations. Those are peaceful demonstrations. But we should say that with Watts in this particular instance, and in many instances in hundreds of cities after, that this was not all peaceful demonstrations. These were riots, and in fact, these were race riots in many cases. So today we talk a lot about riots. These were riots. These were very much with a racial component to them. In fact, H. Rap Brown, when he was in California, was talking about Huey Newton, the founder of the Black Panthers, who was jailed at the time in Oakland, said, "Our only living revolutionary in this country today. He has paid his dues. How many white folks did you kill today?" So there is a real racial component. This is not to say that obviously not all the demonstrations were, but we saw this, and we saw these race riots. And so, not surprisingly, in February of 1968, for the first time in American history, when people said, what is the most important problem facing the country? A lot of people said crime and lawlessness. And 2/3 of people said that the courts didn't deal harshly enough with crime. And so this is something, again, that may sound reminiscent of today, though I would really caution the situation is very different in terms of the demonstrations. So we can talk about that if anyone has questions. So what is the response to this? Well, the Republican response is on the left. Richard Nixon really has a lot to say about law and order, right? So he writes a piece for Reader's Digest. I believe William Safire actually wrote it, but it's called What Has Happened to America? And in that he says the riots are the most virulent symptoms to date of another, in some ways, graver national disorder, the decline in respect for public authority and the rule of law in America. Our opinion makers, and that's a key statement, have gone too far in promoting the doctrine that when a law is broken, society, not the criminal, is to blame. He then goes on to tie Vietnam in this. Thus, we find that many who oppose the war in Vietnam excuse or ignore or applaud those who protest that way, disrupting parades, invading government offices, burning draft cards, blocking troop trains, or desecrating the American flag. What is the Democratic response? So LBJ is very concerned. Crime is up. That's a fact. And so he has a commission and he appoints a congressman to head it. And he's kind of blindsided by what the Congress says. And this is something that might sound very familiar to us, but at the time was very unusual to hear. The commission says our basic conclusion is the nation is moving toward two societies, one black and white. And then goes on to say the vital needs of our nation must be met, hard choices must be made, and if necessary, new taxes enacted. They go on to say that segregation and poverty are something that white Americans don't understand, but they're deeply implicated in that white institutions created it and they maintain it. And while this all has a real ring of truth to this is not what people were expecting to hear, right? How are you going to solve this crisis? They weren't expecting to hear, well, we're going to raise taxes to pay for the looting that's going on. So this response is something that I would say is very much among that kind of new, what we were talking about, the new left, the opinion makers, right? This is the type of response that comes out of it. And people are angry because they see that we're spending all this money. So you take these two issues together and they're saying we have these elites, these college professors, these college kids with their long hair, right? Who don't have to live in the scarier, more crime-ridden parts of the cities and can send their kids to any school they want. And they're so out of touch. And we're the ones putting up with the chaos and the violence, and we're the ones who are now going to be asked. And so basically what we see is a real sort of discussion where people are not happy, obviously, to have been told that. And so that then gets picked up a lot in terms of the things that George Wallace says on the campaign trail. So let me talk to you about these Vietnam protesters. Some of you may have been Vietnam protesters. I know in my own family, I definitely have heard stories about Vietnam protesters. And so it may seem to you that there were a lot of protesters, and there were in certain parts and definitely on campuses. We know about teach-ins, we know about these demonstrations. And we've seen about them, we've heard of them, and we hear, lots about them. But this was not a majority at the time. And these people, love them though we may, were not particularly well liked at that time. And so that same poll that I told you about earlier asked a couple of questions. And they basically said, do you think it was a mistake to enter Vietnam? And do you think the best course of action would be to pull out entirely? Those people, only 17% of white Americans reported those two things. And then when asked to rate Vietnam protesters, now you would think this group is the most pro, the most dovish, the most pro Vietnam demonstrator. 23% of that group placed them at the most extreme point of hostility. And so furthermore, when those same people were asked, what do you think about what was done at the Democratic National Convention with the protests? We see that about 40% thought not enough force had been used against the demonstrators at the Democratic National Convention. Now, there was a small group that rated the protesters very favorably. And what were they like? They were exactly what we might imagine. They were college educated, they were urbane, they were metropolitan, they were young, they were on the young side. And so you see this division developing, right, between those things. And it's wrapping all of those together. It's got the war, it's got the demonstrations against the war, it's got race, and then it's got law and order. And law and order, by the way, is both keeping order, and it's a coded term racially, and we do hear about that now. All right, so if we tie all of this together then, what are we left with? We're left with a year in which we have three particular polarizing issues. And in that particular year, we see that in the end, Richard Nixon prevails, right? He wins by not that much in the popular vote, a little bit less than 1%, but he has a pretty comfortable lead in the Electoral College. And so the outcome of this, how are we to interpret the outcome of this? Could you? Okay, so how are we to do it? And how are we going to put this up? Well, I think that George Wallace sort of sums it up whenever he's putting all of these things together. He says the only four-letter words that hippies don't know are W-O-R-K and S-O-A-P. So he's bringing up, again, tying all of these together. He's tying together this sort of cultural issue, this stew of issues together, right? And so when we were talking about the final event in terms of what we expect to happen after and what we expect to happen today, I have this term here, resilient America. So there's a book by Michael Nelson, and he makes this argument. And he says, very positively, resilient America. We looked at America and we saw cities on fire, and we saw young people against older people. We saw black against white. But we came together and Nixon was elected. And then what happened? So what he argued is that the institutions held. The institutions adapted. The Democratic Party changed so that they then allowed young people to come in. We pass an amendment. We have young people voting. We see the new left gaining power in the Democratic Party. We see the ERA going forward and Nixon supporting the ERA. So we see a lot of things. We see the end of the draft. We see a law which is going to end that and now move to an all-voluntary service. So we see this idea that America was resilient. And so then we come around to 1972, and Nixon wins in a landslide. And so it looks like life has gone on, right? This burning world has ended up being accommodated in some way. Of course, we know what goes on in 1972 and 1973. So I guess I would end with this question about 2020. How resilient is 2020? And here, I don't know if I'm as positive as Michael Nelson is. That's something we can talk about. I think there are a couple of things that make 2020 different. We've had years and years of extreme polarization where we have two parties that don't have those internal contradictions anymore. We have a very liberal Democratic Party in Congress and we have a very conservative Republican Party. And we don't have any room for compromise. We don't have bipartisan bills anymore, or at least not on anything that we're fighting over, or very big bills. And so we see that there may be less chance for that accommodation. And frankly, we see in 2020 something we didn't see in 1968, which is one of the candidates saying that questioning the integrity of the election and the legitimacy of the process before the ballots are hardly even cast. Some are being cast now. So history might teach us that America is resilient, and we have good reason to believe that it would be, but I think also it needs to be vigilant and on guard. So that's all I had, and if people have questions, happy to answer them if I can.
Okay, thank you very much, Suzanne. That was a very interesting summary of what polarization looked like in 1968 and a concluding reminder that we're facing some very significant challenges now. We're starting to get questions. I want to invite people out there to submit your questions through the Q&A function. I'm going to start with a question that's come from our friend Bill Walker, who noted that one of your slides showed a rather dramatic increase in the number of registered black voters in Alabama and Mississippi over the course of the 1960s after the Voting Rights Act. But why was the increase in North Carolina so much less than the increase in Mississippi and Alabama? That is, the percentage of new voters in North Carolina seemed much less than in Mississippi or Alabama.
I think that's an excellent question, and unfortunately, I would love to explore that. I don't have an answer for that. I do know that it started from a higher baseline, right? I believe it was in the 30s versus like 6% for Mississippi. However, Mississippi was so dramatic. My sense is that Mississippi and Alabama were the two most egregious examples of voter suppression. I know that they also were states in which they were those deep South states which moved toward the Dixiecrats, moved toward the Republicans in 1964. I believe North Carolina probably was not as involved or didn't have those issues. So that would be something, I noted that too, actually, in the data, and that's something that would be interesting to look at. So I think that that's an excellent question.
It's an interesting question. Why it looked like in North Carolina it was still, the registration numbers were around 58% of eligible blacks, whereas it went as high as 70% in Alabama. But
Yeah, and
that is an interesting
yeah,
issue.
and I do think that just could be because they sent examiners in, so they could have really been
That's a
honing
good-
in
yeah. So maybe they were more aggressive
in that. But I think
registering.
it's excellent. I would love
Yeah.
to explore that.
So this is another question related to racial issues. This is from Eva Walker, actually. What about the night after Martin Luther King was assassinated and Bobby Kennedy gave a speech in Indianapolis? What was the significance of that and the response to Martin Luther King's assassination by Bobby Kennedy?
Right, and this is one reason I think that people were so devastated by his being assassinated. I mean, it was a devastating act no matter what. But I think that Bobby Kennedy brought so much hope. So he was going to give a speech that night and apparently found out about the assassination there, and he pulls everyone around and he gives this speech. And it's apparently a very riveting speech. And he brings it very personally. And he says, I know what this is like. And he goes on to say, don't be angry, right? I know you want to be angry, but basically alluding to the fact that his brother, I get chills almost thinking about this, having read that speech, that he's seen that personally, but that's not the answer. And so it turns out, and I think Eva, was bringing up the fact that there's violence all over, but in that area, there's not violence, right? And so a lot of people then look to Kennedy. What would he have been like if he hadn't been assassinated? What kind of world would we have? And we know that he was very involved in the war on poverty, but also he was very popular among African American voters. That was a difference between him and McCarthy. He definitely had that vote. So I think that's excellent. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, that is a poignant moment because what we know now is that he's going to be the next person assassinated in that way. Terrible tragedy. The might have beens of history.
Yeah.
So here's a question from our friend Sam Jackson, and Sam asks, how important was the media, and especially television, in exacerbating the polarization in 1968? Of course, this was before the era of social media. But did television play a role in intensifying polarization?
That's interesting. So the media at that time, we were still in the broadcast world, right, where we had the big three networks, and they pretty much dominated at the time. So at least the way most people think about the media of the time was that it was more of a consensus media, that it pretty much towed the administration line in lots of ways. However, although it was consensus, it still had those news norms because it's still profit driven. So any kind of scandal, any kind of gaffe, negativity. News wasn't as negative then as it is now when they've done content analyses of these. I do think the ways it might have affected it would have been more indirect. Number one, this was called the living room war, Vietnam. So having those images beamed into people's living rooms really affected how they felt about the war. So I think that played a role. And then not just the war, but those images of the protesters. What's so interesting to me is people who've later studied it said that the reaction to the protests at the Democratic National Convention, where they were showing police actually beating students, was that people were siding with the police at that time. So it was just a different time. So I think now polarization is exacerbated by the media that we have. I think they definitely played into the negativity of the time and the polarization. But I would say now the media we have are really set up to polarize more than then.
Yeah, so social media has a more polarizing effect even than those three networks could ever imagine.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is a question from Niels Brubaker. And it has to do also with the question of change. Do you think the primary election system that evolved after 1968 has become a leading cause of polarization in today's politics, not only at the presidential level, but at all levels, that the primaries drive a more polarized political culture?
I actually really do. And so especially in preparing for this lecture, I teach a campaigns and elections class, so I think a lot about the primaries. And I do think that the primary system, there are some negative, all reforms have unintended consequences. So these reforms were supposed to open up the process, but really what they did was bring in these other players and make them more powerful. So the media and different interest groups, for example. And one thing that he's probably rightly thinking about as well is donations and money from particular interest groups. So what I would say is, in the end, there was a theory for a while that the parties coordinated behind the scenes, and they mostly ended up with who they would have wanted otherwise. So they kind of got together, had a national conversation about it, and decided and coordinated on a candidate. But you didn't have that in 2016, right? Especially with Donald Trump. And so I would say that this primary system really has fed some of the polarization. And I think it feeds it, you're right to also mention at the lower levels, because a lot of people are worried about being primaried from their left if they're Democrats, or from their right if they're Republicans. And that concern makes them not want to compromise across the aisle, because they're always kind of looking toward that next potential to be primaried, which is so, to a congressperson, is something that strikes fear. So I think that's an excellent question. I think it, on balance, it shows that it's good to have people involved in the process, but there's some negative things that happen when you do that too.
So when there were the old proverbial smoke-filled rooms, they tended to push things more toward the center.
Yes, definitely.
So this is a question actually from Max Orr, who's part of our team here, and he's wondering about the idea of the silent majority, which became a very important concept in the late 60s. And the assumption is the silent majority is a center-right political orientation. But is it true that this is somewhat misleading, because in fact there are now silent majorities that support positions such as pro-choice or gun control or gay marriage or environmental reform? In other words, does this concept of the silent majority still operate now as it did in the late 60s?
Yeah, I think this whole concept of the silent majority is really interesting, and this is another one of those parallels, right? I mean, exact parallels. It's almost like ripped a page out of the 1968 playbook, and with you see Trump tweeting "law and order," over and over again, and he will tweet the silent majority. So it's interesting, this concept of the silent majority versus the loud minority, and we see that brought up now, especially with all these protests that are going on, and this attempt to sort of say, oh, these are just loud minority, really with the silent majority. I do think that concept has changed. I think that we do see majorities supporting a lot of these sort of cultural, the idea then was, oh, the majority are against these cultural changes. What we see now is the majorities favor gay marriage, the majorities favor abortion rights. And so I think that concept has changed. And I don't think a lot of America is silent anymore. I hear talk about the shy Trump voters, and I just don't put the word shy and Trump together that often, right? So I think it's something people talk about, this possibility, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence to believe that there's a silent majority right now.
So just related to that question about women also, nowadays there's a big discussion of the gender gap between men and women voters. Did that exist in 1968?
Where it really started happening was in 1980 with Reagan. So that's where we really start seeing. So I'm not exactly sure at that time what it was, but from 1980 on is when you really see it.
That's when it meant.
And we see it quite strongly in this, at least the polling data. Who knows what's actually going to happen, right, in the polling data. But yes, there may have been a bit of a difference in the 68 election. I don't know that there was, but it's really more with the Reagan election that you see that.
So here's a question relating more specifically to the Republican Party from Kenneth Zeitler. Do you foresee the demise of the Republican Party or the rise of a new party in its place or in American politics? I guess this carries us well beyond 1968. But there was a realignment of parties in 1968. I mean,
right.
you noted the Democrats and Republicans flipped, for example, on racial issues in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Is it possible that another such adjustment or transition is taking place today?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about that. We haven't seen it yet. in terms of I'll take the demise part first. So we haven't seen that yet. I know there's been a lot of consternation in the Republican Party about that. So we have a country which is moving rapidly toward being a majority-minority country, and we see the percentage of the electorate that is white dropping every year. And so after 2012, the Republicans kind of did a postmortem, like, what should we do as a party? And they came out and said we should embrace immigration reform, all these kind of more moderate things. But what happens in 2016? We end up with Donald Trump. So what's promised, to me, it's the classic collective action problem. If the Republicans keep on in this fashion, they're going to have short-term gain. They won in 2016. We don't know yet what's going to happen in 2020. Right now, the polls aren't looking good for them, but I don't say anything after 2016. I don't make any predictions in that regard. But with these short-term gains, we also see that, though, in Congress, by the way, because of how we have districts which are so homogenous now, and people are clustered so much among like-minded people. Congress is becoming increasingly polarized. And so they just don't have the incentives, the personal incentives, to worry about their collective brand. If the Republicans lose in 2020, if they lose badly, then I think you might start to see people reevaluate. It's hard for me to see how they can continue much more as the party that right now, as the party that they are. Sure, right now it's working for them, but it's hard to see if we continue with this cleavage going forward. It's really hard to see how they're going to survive. So I think they will have to adapt at that time. Yeah.
So this is a question from Seth, who writes, did state and local politics become polarized at the same rate as national politics, or state politics as polarized? Seth says, I'm only 34 years old, but I can remember more moderate Republicans, even from my own youth in North Carolina. In other words, has it become as polarized at the local level as at the national level?
That is also a really good question. So Seth says a good point. One thing that's interesting, we talk about this realignment. It kind of has a trickle-down effect. So it happened at the national level, and I should mention that when I talked about race not mattering as a political issue, I really should have clarified that I meant at the national level, because especially in the South, that was an issue that was continually an issue. So it took a while. So even though Nixon is winning, the Democrats are still maintaining their position in Congress for quite a while, and the Democrats are still doing fine in the South for a while. But now we look at the South and we see that's a completely different story. So it was a longer process for states and localities. The party had to build up. They really didn't have much of a party, any infrastructure in the South, for example. So I do think back in the 70s and the 80s, we did see more, probably especially in the South. We had Jimmy Carter, who's elected president, with this kind of coalition of a centrist Democrat with majority African-American support. So you sort of had that model. But at the same time, you had Jesse Helms, right, in North Carolina. So it just kind of depended. You also had a lot of these Southern Democrats just switch right away and go to the Republican Party. To me, it does seem like, yes, the parties at the state and local level are as polarized, and in many ways even more polarized
as they are at the national level. Yeah, that's a good point. This is, I think, more of a comment from our friend Claudia Cadis, who points out we need to remember the role of CNN, MSNBC, and Fox today, and they weren't even on the air in the 1960s. But you had made that point about the three big networks having a much greater influence. This is a question from Virginia Gray about polarization. The question is, during the Vietnam War, some families were so divided they couldn't even discuss the war issue around the dinner table. Some draft dodgers were disowned by their families. Do you think that we're seeing splits today that are comparable, that people can't talk to each other at the dinner table?
I definitely do, and that's an interesting way of putting it. My own family, I know, I have a brother-in-law who was very much against the war, and apparently, according to my husband, that it was very contentious every dinner, just shouting and storming off. I do think that there's some evidence to believe that people have become so polarized. We just look at, people who have, friendships that have been destroyed. We see over time this thing called affective polarization. So even if most Americans don't follow politics that much, and even if they don't really tune into the specifics of policy, what we know is that the parties dislike each other so much more now than they ever did. They perceive the other side as a threat.
Yeah.
They give them very low ratings on a feeling thermometer score. Even they ask questions, would you be disappointed if your son or daughter were to marry someone of a different party? And you're getting up to 50% of Republicans saying, yes, I would be upset by that.
Yeah.
And so I do think you're seeing they call this idea of social distancing. But anyway, there's a distance. You're seeing people don't like the other party. So that's a great question.
So who knows? We have the proverbial Thanksgiving dinner now where people can hardly speak to each other. We're going to wrap up with just a couple of questions. One is the issue of religion. Religious ideas are so strong now. Joanna Smith asked about this. Did religion play a major role in 1968? So
I think that is also something that you could include in this, not as as nearly as polarizing of an issue as Vietnam or race or law and order, but along those same lines, right, in terms of tradition. So we didn't really see the evangelical, the church, getting so involved in politics, as a force and an organizing force, really until Reagan. So we see as an organizing force, that happens. We also know the New Deal coalition involved Catholics and urban ethnics. One thing that I really want to make clear with that too, that reminds me that working class, sort of ethnic working class, those appeals, those populist appeals. So I think that this it would fit very well with a cleavage like this, where we're talking about tradition, we're talking about order. I think it's more of a latent thing at that time, because we just don't have it as organized religion was not as political at that point. But I definitely think that it fits in very well with that. And we see an increasing trend towards secularism, obviously, much less the case in 1968, but it would fit in very well with that.
So it was really the culture wars of the 1960s that contributed to this kind of religious as well as political polarization.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
So two final questions. One from Paul Connick about polarization in Congress. What about the role of gerrymandering, which has exacerbated, we talked about primaries contributing to polarization, where in effect state legislatures gerrymander in ways that representatives choose their voters rather than voters choosing their representatives? Has that contributed to polarization?
So I think to a certain extent there has been some contribution. This is one of these political science findings that someone asked one time, what are some of the findings that are most surprising to people or that they most don't believe? And that is that gerrymandering, it's actually a debate, but the evidence most people have cited seems to come down to the fact that it doesn't contribute as much as we think to polarization. So a contributor, yes, and certainly in certain states like North Carolina, how can you see that process and not see a clear link, right? But I think the reason to explain that a little bit is that what we're seeing is this geographical sorting so much that we have in the U.S. people who have now moved more. These cities, we didn't used to have these cities that are so overwhelmingly, or areas or neighborhoods. You might think about your own city or your own neighborhood and take a walk around the block and count the number of Trump signs and the number of Biden signs, right? And what you're seeing is not many people are living in areas where you got a lot of both. And so what people find is that the Democrats are actually, let's say, disadvantaged by the sheer fact that their supporters dwell in cities, so they're inefficient, is the way you say it. They're packed into these cities. So even when they win by very large margins, they can't get more than one congressional seat out of that. So yes, to respond, I think that you have to think it plays a role. It just doesn't play as big a role as people tend to attribute to it.
Okay, thank you. We have a few other comments and questions, but I want to remind everyone that we're going to have the final session of the seminar tomorrow evening at 5:30. And in this panel discussion, Freddie Kiger and Suzanne and I will all be together for responding to questions. But I want to, there's a question here from James Evans that maybe is a bridge to tomorrow. Come on now, you know a lot more about all of this than we do. Can you make a prediction as to what will happen on November the 3rd?
Well, gosh, I'm like I said, I'm very scarred by what happened in 2016. My gut right now, or not, what I think right now, in my opinion, I do believe that Biden is on track to win the election, barring any crazy unforeseen event.
Well, we never know what might happen.
Yes, but that's what I would say as of right now. But who knows?
This is why historians can talk about what used to happen or what happened in the past, but political scientists can predict also what happened in the future. It's going to happen in the future.
But one thing that I would comment about that is I don't know that we're going to know what happened on November 3rd, because I think this election, depending on how close it is, we may have election week versus election day. So I think everyone should prepare for the fact that it may not be over on election day. It could be, but that's a possibility as well.
It could be like 2000.
Yes,
that was a very painful year too. That one, we didn't even include that election, but we could talk about that tomorrow. I want to thank everybody who has joined us this evening. You will receive tomorrow the Zoom address for the final session of the seminar. And I want to thank Suzanne for a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You can hear people cheering somewhere in the background. We're all on this together. And thank you so much for this presentation. And thank all of you for joining us. Have a good evening. There's a debate tonight, so maybe there'll be more polarization to discuss by tomorrow. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.